Happy St. George's Day, everybody, and by a happy coincidence, happy birthday, William Shakespeare, the greatest of all people associated with St. George. So, national considerations having been set apart, we embark on this great international exercise, which is the history of capitalism. A brief resume of the history of this course. It was an idea of mine in the middle, when was it? Towards the end of 2013, when this institute was in the middle of an extensive revision of its various programs of study. And it occurred to me that a course of study devoted to the history of capitalism would be rather a good idea, mostly because it wasn't really being done properly anywhere else in the United Kingdom, in my view. And that a history of capitalism really was something that accorded very well with the defining goals and attributes of the Legatum Institute, being devoted to international issues and, broadly speaking, an interdisciplinary approach. Because the person who's only interested in economics is not really going to be the person who's going to be able to understand the history of capitalism. This is an ism which has to transcend economics since it relates to culture, life of philosophy, ethics, and the life of politics more generally. So having gained the approval of our wise and beneficent board and trustees, and I'm very grateful to them for their continuing support for this wonderful program, we set about inventing a syllabus and trying to find the kind of scholars who would be clever enough, witty enough, brave enough, learned enough to entice our audiences and to launch this course. And I'm very happy to be able to say that we found such scholars, 3 of whom are with me this evening, and the other 2 are desperately disappointed at their inability to be with us, but will be returning to the Legatum Institute very, very soon in the near future. And they are, of course, as you'll see in the pamphlet that is being published this evening and which has been placed on your seats, Benedict Köhler, who advanced a possible thesis about Islam and capitalism, David Abulafia, who entertained us with his account of the later Middle Ages in the 15th century, and then Victoria Batesman, who came from Keyes, Cambridge, to talk about the early modern period, Hugh Bowen, who took us on a wonderful account of the plunder of Sub-Asia in the name of the East India Company, and then Nicholas Crafts, who brought his customary piercing light of understanding to the issues that arise in the course of the Industrial Revolution, the revolution so-called. And we then thought we had to bring them back in order to have a little bit of an account of what it was all about in the course of 2014. So this has been your opportunity to raise these questions with these distinguished scholars who are with us this evening. And I'm going to start by asking each of you in turn to consider this question. In talking about this famous ism, capitalism, are we talking about a way of describing an ideology, a doctrine, a teaching, or is it a word that describes institutions, practices, the way the world works? It's a very big question, but I'm going to start by asking Nick Crafts what he thinks might be the answer to that question.
I was really hoping to find out what my colleagues thought before reacting to them. Well, I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer this, but let me start the ball rolling. I come here as a sort of common or garden, rather humble economist, so this limits my perspective. From an economics perspective, capitalism, or various varieties of it, clearly it's about how you run the economy, it's about how you allocate resources, it's about how you generate appropriate incentive structures, it's about how you organize an efficient economy, if you like. Seen as such, I suspect for most economists, including me, it wouldn't entail blind faith in markets completely uncontrolled or unconstrained or unregulated. Might be a presumption that the market knows best until you can think that it doesn't. But what I think as an economist would be my position is that actually to construct capitalism into an ideology where the market is always right is actually quite a dangerous thing to do. So that would be my first proposition, I think. I think second thing that I would probably want to say is that the way one thinks about capitalism, I think, turns a lot on the concept of and the justification for profit. Profit is an absolutely key feature of a capitalist economy. For some people, particularly perhaps the ideological opponents of capitalism, one might say profit is a very dirty word. They think in terms of a kind of zero-sum game in which profit is taken away from workers and given to rich, undeserving people. For the economist, I think profit is an important signal. It's a signal as to where resources should be placed in the economy, and it's a measure also, or at least we're thinking of, the notion that actually capital is a scarce resource. It needs to be used well. It has an opportunity cost, and the profit which it earns is actually justified in a well-run economy by its opportunity cost. You could use that capital to do something else. Now those seem to probably people imbued with economics, pretty sort of commonsensical propositions. Whether or not they comprise a dangerous ideology, I think it might be in the hands of the user. In particular, as I say, let me go back to the notion that I don't think a good defender of capitalism would want to say markets are always efficient.
Always efficient.
And someone who does is, I think, taking a rather idealized construct of capitalism, which doesn't, for me, match the real world. So that's a starting couple of
Thank you very much indeed. Benedict, an account of the way the world has worked or should work?
I think it accounts for the way the world does work. Simply for this reason, capitalism may seem like something that's invisible, because it is. We are never, as individuals, wholly individual, and there is such a thing as society, but we are never wholly subsumed by society. There is something in between the individual and society. And the approach with which you mediate the interests of the individual and society, that can take the form of capitalism. That mental construct and that attitude, what makes it different from other attitudes? I think Nicholas was quite right when he lit on the term profit as being absolutely essential. I remember when I started my career a good long time ago, I had to analyze balance sheets, and the word profit, where I come from in Germany back then, had the word Vortrag, which means carry forward, because that's what the German translation of profere actually is. And profit was what's left at the end of a year to take into the following year, and you look to a company to expand its profit because it's an indication that the company can grow. So that's capitalism. It's about being subservient to the growth of an organization. So this introduces a third element. There's the individual, there's society, and there's the company. And that's capital. Capitalism is between the three.
So, Victoria, profit, necessary feature of capitalism. Capitalism is about growth. It's about a tomorrow rather than just a description of the cake that we've got today. Helps us to grow it. And in using the word, therefore, are we using a system of ideas, or are we describing the way the world works?
Well, I mean, I think one of the problems in current debates is we tend to talk at cross purposes when we talk about capitalism. Capitalism means very different things to different people. You know, to some people it's big business, it's exploitation, it's excessive profits. And if you look at more of an economics textbook view of capitalism, then it's about perfect competition. You know, small businesses competing and getting very little in the way of profits because they're working, you know, close to the bone, competing with others, pushing prices down as low as they can to attract consumers. So capitalism means different things to different people. It works differently in the real world to the way that it works in the textbook. So certainly what we have seen over the last couple of 100 years is capitalism has perhaps moved away from a system in which we have small firms, often owned and run by the same people, that operate within a limited boundary, say, of an individual country, and that take consumers' demands as given. And what we have today is large firms operating on a global scale, owned by thousands of people, including, people out there in the audience through their pensions pots and so on. And these large firms have the power to affect prices, to influence what we want to buy, to influence our tastes and so on. So there's a textbook capitalism, there's a practical capitalism, the way it works in the real world. I would say, given that we all have different definitions of capitalism, my definition would involve two aspects. The first is markets, that the way that we acquire the things that we need to live is by buying and selling. So we sell our labour to firms so that we can acquire the money that we need to pay for our rent, to buy our food, to buy our clothes, and so on. Now, markets have existed for, hundreds, thousands of years, but what is much newer is the second aspect of capitalism, at least the way that I would define it, which is the capital aspect, which is people using a combination of capital and labour to produce, machinery and labour to produce, rather than, say, land and labour, which you see in a more agricultural economy. And I absolutely agree with Nick Crafts about profit being something that incentivizes you to build a business, to produce, to expand what you're doing, to innovate, looking into the future, to plough that back and to grow the economy into the future. The very nature of capitalism within capitalism leads to technology, scientific change, and so on, which are something that capital can feed on. Does that?
I think that's admirable, and that's an opportunity now for the studio audience to intervene and to offer their hypothesis and their thoughts about what we've just heard. Does anybody wildly disagree, or might somebody even agree? Yes, Michael.
Thanks. A question, a sort of general question. If you look at what's just happened to us in the last 5 or 6 years, with the worst financial crisis for 80 years, arguably maybe even longer, macroeconomists have really had no idea why it happened. They're struggling to explain it, etc. Should they be looking more at history? Because history surely can teach lots of lessons about this.
I'll intervene with them, and I'll just say something about that phrase, lessons of history, because it does recur, and I think quite often it's the phrase lessons of history, again, means different things to different people, but quite often when people use that phrase, they really mean looking at the past and finding information in the past that can be of use in deepening our understanding of the present, rather than sort of straightforward applicability. So it's a deepening source of historical information. I would say myself that the economists went mad and wanted to be mathematicians. That's my brief explanation of what happened in 2007, 2008. Victoria, too much mathematical aspiration around.
Absolutely. I think one of the problems with economics in the last at least 30, 40 years is that it has cut itself off from the wider social sciences. So when we look at the economy, there is a need to bring in politics, society, religion, so many different things that feed into the economy. And the economy can in turn affect society, religion, and politics. And economists, in a plight to turn their subject into a science, something more like physics, have seen these other things as somehow not rigorous enough and not worthy of their incorporation in their models. So if something like religion or society can't fit easily into a system of equations, then let's just leave it out. If incorporating a real understanding of human behavior that psychology would give us, that people are about more than just being self-interested and in it for the money, if that better understanding of human behavior is difficult to incorporate into a set of equations where you want to maximize something, then we leave it out. So I think in an effort to increase the mathematical side of economics, we've lost many other things.
And in the process, driving human beings out of the scale of economic life and thought altogether. Nick, any thoughts about that? Too much mathematics around in the discipline?
I'm not sure I do entirely agree on the too much mathematics, but I certainly agree on the too little history. It seems to me, if you think about the crisis and macroeconomists, I think you could distinguish between their failure to predict it, question as to how well they understood it when it had occurred, and then thirdly, how well policymakers responded. I think we should give policymakers some credit for responding much better than they had done 80 years earlier in the Great Depression. There's a massive difference between the sort of year 2, year 3 experience of those crises. On the understanding bit, I don't think either history or good economics would really buy the efficient markets paradigm, which is often used rather casually and quickly in model building. In particular, I don't think it would because, and this is where the sort of textbook story of very simple economics breaks down, surely the world is one of incomplete and asymmetric information. Once the world is thought of like that, we immediately recognize that it's a world subject to issues like moral hazard and adverse selection, which are ways it's well known that financial markets fail. In other words, we actually do have quite a good theory of financial crises, which is sitting out there in a different branch of economics. The peculiar thing is that was completely divorced from the standard macro model, which probably was dominated by a certain sort of mathematics. So in a sense, I come back to agreeing with Victoria. But I don't think it's that economics was completely helpless in diagnosing what's going on in this story. And as I say, I think this is a story about powerful incentive structures and the damage they can do in a situation where information is incomplete.
And is the idea perhaps of a completely predictive economic system, a system of knowledge that tells you what's going to happen, is this completely bonkers or just slightly bonkers? I wonder.
Well, I think the lesson of 2008 and the return of the historians to economics is less the story of too much, too little, the right or the wrong mathematical models. It's the story that we've heard since from Greek myth. It's the story of hubris. It's not the mathematical models, it's the reliance on it and the assumption we've sorted everything, we know everything. I remember when I was in a dealing room a good long time ago, there was an American president who said, there are no business cycles any longer. That was in 1987, just a few months before Black October, which by standards of the time was a first-rate crash. And since then, crashes have been getting worse, but we think alongside this, we understand them much better.
I remember there was a Chancellor of the Exchequer in recent history who said that he'd abolished the boom-bust cycle as well. But an act of hubris of most astonishing nature, really. Yes, Victoria.
I like to think about this as we think about car crashes, right? Car crashes will always happen out there. But car crashes will only kill if people drive along those roads thinking that there are barriers that will automatically push them back onto the road if they start to veer off, and if they assume their windscreen is so clear that they can race ahead, that they know what's coming in the future. And the way I think about capitalism is that we don't always have those barriers that will lead us to adjust back to equilibrium where we should be. And the vision through our windscreen is not entirely clear, and sometimes we get things wrong. We're overconfident, sometimes the opposite, and we need to be a bit more careful.
Yeah, it's the gods of the copybook headings quite often as well, isn't it? You know, be careful, sometimes be cautious, but sometimes you've got to allow the animal spirits to resume their sway in human affairs. Yes, Benedict.
Well, but I just wonder, the point was raised earlier about the handling of the crisis, and goodness me, we've seen a lot of pros and cons about the handling of the crisis. Is there something that can be seen from history in our approach to the post-crisis handling of these? Because it seems to me that one thing we learned from a financial crisis is next time there is one, there won't be another one, because now we've really got it sorted. But next time when there is one, we've got the right solution. We're going to have more government get involved. So from crisis to crisis, as you go from era to era, you find government takes on more and more responsibilities. And I think this last crisis is no exception to trend. We now have more regulation and more government intervention than you would have thought compatible with the capitalist society before 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. There's good and bad to this human responsiveness to crisis, isn't there, when we get going again? I mean, the bad side is we get very sanguine and we think it's all been sorted, but the fundamental optimism of human nature reasserts itself and thinks, right, we're going to power ahead and tomorrow's going to be a better day. Yes, Victoria, you want to come in there?
Yes, I guess there are different ways of interpreting, responding to the crisis. There are obviously those that say this is proof that the capitalist system is not working and that we need, for example, more regulation, more state intervention. But then there are the defenders of, let's say, free markets rather than capitalism, who argue the problem is that we haven't let free markets work to their full potential. So, for example, the big banks and the big businesses are not what you should find in a free market model of the economy. For example, Joseph Stiglitz, who has a new book coming out, well, I think it's just come out this week, The Great Divide.
He's always got a new book coming out.
It makes the point that perhaps we weren't tough enough in the years on the run-up to the crisis with regard to big business and big banks. We had this crony capitalism that developed. And so perhaps part of the solution is in making free markets work as they should, but then also accepting that there are downsides, there are times that they can go wrong. So I think that you have two extreme interpretations of the financial crisis, and really the truth is there's something in each of them.
I can see some puzzled looks and speculation occurring on the faces of some of our audience here. I'll get onto those in just a minute, but I'll be calling on you after Benedict has said something. Yes.
Oh, well, we've spoken about history and what history can tell us about the recent events, but I'd be even, how will I even be straying into the era of philosophy? I remember when I was a student, people would read a philosopher, Hegel, who would speak about the cunning of history. It's very odd that in the capitalist world now, we read financial papers and they advocate policies which really match that of a planned economy in Eastern Europe, which capitalism overcame much for the better, and we were very grateful for it. But we've reintroduced policies which we would have recommended.
Example of such a policy in this country?
I understand, though I don't work in a central bank, that one of the metrics for central bank performance is the stock exchange index. And when you think of that stabilizing the stock exchange is one of the goals, the aims of a central bank. And if you realize the stock exchange is responsible for allocating resources in the economy, it's very hard for me to tell the difference between a planned economy and what we are practicing.
So possible return to the planned economy. Ladies and gentlemen, opportunity to say just a few words, 2 or 3 questions, then we'll move on to the second big issue here, which is immigration in contemporary policy making. Yes, and when you speak, can you just tell us who you are and an institutional affiliation, if that is at all relevant?
David Conway, my affiliation is Civitas. You mentioned at the outset that the distinguishing characteristic of the mode of production, to use the jargon of someone I think who perhaps could be regarded as having coined the term capitalism, was capital and labour. But the term capital itself surely is a very ambiguous term in the sense that it can refer to material objects, but it can also refer to money, which is more nebulous, and money used for the purposes of creating more money. Now, the reason I mention this in connection with the crisis of 2008, 7-8, is that there is a school of thought, is there not, which attributes responsibility for that crisis to an intervention in the market in America with the subprime mortgages, where there was a great encouragement for people to purchase their homes without actually having the wherewithal. And a lot of these companies which provided mortgages were under a lot of pressure from government to do that. They then tried to get rid of the debt by packaging it up in various ways, which transported the infection overseas. But the general point I want to make is that surely, if we're trying to unlock the mystery of what is responsible for crises, we should be considering more monetary policy and banking. I mean, you know, it's been said by some of the panel that that they've dealt with the problem better than was dealt with in the crash of the 30s. Well, the way we got out of it was quantitative easing. It remains to be seen with the debt now that's hanging over us, whether or not we're not just storing up more trouble down the line.
Thank you very much. On an informational point of view, and as the introduction to this collection of essays points out, the word capitale is a late Latin word that established itself as a description for a merchant stock of goods by the late 12th, early 13th century. And the rest, as they say, is history. And yes, Michael.
Does it come from Latin caput?
Yes, it does.
And
yeah.
so in Arabic you get Ismailia.
Quite possibly so.
Literally like
Yeah.
head money.
Head money.
So I do wonder like why it means what it means. Like, is it all about? Does it mean like individualism, like you know, on your head be it, or is it like you know, does it have an idea of like kind of something at the top?
It's a relationship to the head of the firm, the head of the business, the person who's got the stock and who can actually employ it and use it. And capitalist, as a description for a certain kind of person, I mean, it's a very neutral term, and it's there in our language by the middle of the 17th century, and it describes somebody who's got this capital, rather than any more extensive description. Anyway, that little historical excursion having been put to one side, there are a few more questions I could see. Yes, Serena, yes.
It's nothing ideological. What occurs to me now in hearing, Irina Somerton, Institute of Historical Research, University of London, that an important element of the crash was the extraordinary outbreak of criminality and corruption on the part of people working in the banks. And we now know almost all about it, because, you know, one big fine after another is coming out. And it turns out, I mean, like LIBOR, it turns out that 5 or 6 of the largest banks in the world, Barclays, Bank of America, UBS, HSBC, a couple of others, manipulated LIBOR for months and months to their own and their banks' advantages. And there's so many examples of that. You know, it's been coming out over the past few years. Bank of America has received the largest fine in the history of the United States, $19 billion, for selling the bad loan packages knowingly. You know, they were accused of not doing it accidentally, but knowing that they were packaging and selling bad loans overseas. And, you know, I could go on and on, but this was an important element of the crash because it happened because of this convergence of banking criminality. And this has really tarnished the name of capitalism.
Well, a moment there to pause and reflect. Manipulation, illegality, lots of very naughty people, apparently, involved in the whole business of making money. Hold the front page for that one. How might you respond?
Well,
is it astonishing that there should be this degree of illegality?
It's not astonishing that illegality leads to a collapse of capitalism, because capitalism depends critically on the virtues of civil society. And capitalist societies, when they flourish, are usually promoted by people who have placed great store in probity and in reliability. It's when you have a society where anything goes and cutting corners doesn't matter that much, then you can't expect anything else other than that decadence spreads.
Right. Decadence spreads. The Reverend Mr. Mark Jones.
Isn't it interesting that you have this... Mark Jones, I teach at Eton. That at the same time, at the top level, you've got LIBOR, you've got the sort of things that Gillian Tett describes in her book. But also you have a kind of cultural social permission to lots of people to build up personal debt. And that, it seems to me, is a feature of the last 50 years or so, where, in a sense, a lot of people thinking this was a perfectly good thing to extend their prosperity, thought they would do it. But now there's a distinctly queasy look at it when you work out what the level of private debt is. I mean, ordinary personal debt, rather than the grand banks and so on. Which just prompts me to say, well, aren't there perhaps deeper cultural, social, philosophical influences that mould capitalism in each generation into something perhaps really quite different at times from what it has been before? That capitalism somehow is something that's very plastic.
Yes.
And there are other cultural indicators or cultural influences that make it in whatever generation it is, what
and that is
what
why
it turns
it
out to be.
recurs and has been so successful, and it's prepared to take on the different shadings of so many different cultures, and that accounts for its growth, therefore perhaps rather like Christianity. Victoria.
Yes, I think this ties very neatly with the work of an Oxford economic historian, Avner Offer, and his view that what's happened over the past since World War II is we've moved from a society in which we perhaps think about the long term to one in which we think about the short term. Now, short-termism in financial markets is obviously identified as a problem, but I guess what he's saying is that there is a wider problem in our society that for a prosperous society, we need to sometimes restrain ourselves and think about the long term. And this applies to many walks of life. You know, if it's, for example, long-term commitment through marriage, if it is saving for your future through a pension scheme, if it's foregoing income early in your life to be educated so that you can have more career prospects. You know, there are different ways in which we have to restrain ourselves for our own good in the long term. Now, to some extent, state institutions helped us to do that many years ago. So, for example, you know, a state pension system. Free education also perhaps encouraged us in a particular direction. And I guess that one of the things that's happened as the free market has become more popular, and with it this view that individuals are capable of looking after themselves, that they can be relied upon to make the right decisions, more decisions have moved from the hands of the state into individuals, and that's in a way given them the rope to hang themselves on, or if they don't hang themselves, to be successful, but one or the other. So I think there is a wider problem of short-termism that spans our economy and our society.
Now, I'm going to move on now to the next question, but there will be an opportunity for those questions that I can see bursting to appear on the horizon in the far distance. Those points can be made later on. But I want to move on to the question of immigration. And one of the really powerful motivations that we had as an institute to introduce this history of capitalism, of course, was to enable us to reflect on the contemporary situation in which we find ourselves in this country and in the Western world more generally. And immigration is just such a question, and it's been raised in many emails that we've received since announcing this panel from people who've been attending the course of lectures. And I'll just read out one such question, and then I will raise it in a question to the three panelists. Trade networks are shown in your lectures to be platforms for the exchange of business practices between Arabia and the Middle East and Europe, for the growth of banking in Renaissance Europe, for the expansion of early colonial and commercial activity. How far was this dependent on fairly free movement of peoples? Was this freedom of movement hampered by political conflicts? And what does this course, Reflections on the History of Capitalism, what might it tell us about how to approach the current crisis, if there is a crisis, of immigration today? Immigration is a big contemporary issue. It's recurring in the course of this general election campaign. But Nick, the whole history of economics and economic thought shows that capital growth, economic growth, needs people to, if not get on their bikes, at least to get on their ships and to get into their cars and move around and search for a better world.
Let me suggest that I think the world of migration in the past, even as recently as 2 centuries ago, is quite different from now, in 2 ways in particular. Firstly, that relatively few people could actually finance migration 2 centuries ago. You actually get the paradox that as wage gaps narrow in the late 19th century between, say, Southern Europe and the United States, actually migration goes up rather than down, the reason being the extra wages in Southern Europe allow the finance of the trip.
This is what you're writing about at the moment.
No, not really.
Is it migrants, not migration?
No, but you know, there are barriers to migration which are non-policy barriers, is what I'm trying to suggest. You know, those barriers might be information costs, but they're quite often simply travel costs, if you wish. So I think we live in a world where the potential volume of migration is probably higher than it's ever been, partly because people can finance it much more easily, and partly because the success of, shall we call it the West in simple terms, over the last 200 years has actually opened up much bigger income gaps than we ever saw before. So the incentives and the wherewithal to finance migration have both gone up. The second thing that I think is surely quite different from 2 to 3 centuries ago is I don't think migrants are nearly as important as they once were in what I'll call loosely technology transfer. We have other ways of learning about technology. That's what globalization has been all about in various ways. Globalization of knowledge, more codified knowledge, less tacit knowledge. We don't actually, on the whole, need large numbers of people to move to get that knowledge to cross borders. So in that sense, migration is less valuable. If you were to say, what is the policy issue? It seems to me that if one were thinking about something which would relatively rapidly improve the allocation of economic resources around the world, it would be to free up migration. Because in the sense of removing quite a lot of the policy barriers to it. If one does that, however, is one happy with the result? And the question then turns on how similar we think migrants are to ourselves. So probably none of us would want to judge this simply on the basis of the economic efficiency argument. The compromise that some people have proposed is to argue that maybe today's policy world should think about ways of generating temporary migration, which allows some of the benefit of the transfer of labour without conveying full citizenship or rights to stay permanently. The difficulty with that, as I think we saw in post-war West Germany, but I can be contradicted on that, is if that is the solution you'd like to follow, whether you can credibly commit to making that migration temporary, or de facto you concede that it is permanent.
Well, Victoria, your career, your professional career, has involved a significant migration from Lancashire to Cambridge and now to London. So you bring your own authority to this subject to bear.
Yes, I was born in East Manchester to a long line of cotton mill workers. Yes, that's where my grandparents worked in local cotton mills, and so I grew up with a whole sense of the Industrial Revolution, a sense that Manchester was once the centre of the world. And when I was growing up in the 1980s, it was a place of deindustrialisation, of economic decline, of social deprivation, and I guess that's one of the things that started me thinking from quite early on in life, what makes regions or countries successful, why do they decline, and how can they rejuvenate themselves? But to come back to a point that Nick was making, we like to think of ourselves as living in a democratic society, one in which our talents and how hard we work determines where we end up in life. But of course, the sad thing is when you look at the world as a whole, what determines where you end up in life, how much money you have, whether you die in a comfortable bed, is not how brainy you are or what talents you have, but where you are born, that simple lottery of where you are born. And it is no wonder that, as we've seen in the news over the last few days, that so many people lose their lives in that plight to get from, for example,
Yes,
Africa
from
here
North Africa
to Europe.
to-
But I do, in a sense, you can see where this backlash against immigration is coming from, because what we have seen over the last few years is this great globalization that has increased the effective labour supply for businesses here in the West, either through offshoring or through immigrants coming into the West. But I don't think the solution is to put up barriers and to stop those people coming in. I think we should have sympathy for those people. And if I can a little bit later on, I will suggest an alternative solution that revolves around women.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that, and I've put that as a little package in the second half of this discussion. Now, Benedict, am I right in saying that you were born in New York City, or brought, and then the Federal Republic of Germany, and now here? So yours has been a very big migration.
So I'm an immigrant here, and I've done very well out of it, and so I'm quite grateful for it. And I wouldn't consider myself a showcase immigrant. Other people accomplish much more, but I'm perfectly in favor of migration. And one has to consider many people are not voluntary migrants, but involuntary. And this country also has benefited from many involuntary immigrants, such as the Huguenots and many others. So I'm all in favor of it, and I think they leaven the culture on which capitalism depends, because they also provide a comparator for attitudes, for example, of civic society and of personal virtue, because many people who immigrate do not have the cash to borrow, and so they, of necessity, live very abstemious lives, postponing the rewards to more often than not, to the generation after the next generation. And they set an example for what makes capitalism great.
Well, London has always been a very important part of the history of migration, especially so in the 19th century, when lots of Russian migrants ended up here, including the famous anarchist, founding father's school of anarchism, as a school of political philosophy, Mikhail Bakunin, who was independently very, very rich and had a butler, and lived in a rather fine style on Highgate Hill. And eager anarchists coming to see Bakunin were always rather bemused for the first time to find a butler opening the door. Various questions arise. There are various hands that are going up earlier, and you not restrict yourselves indeed to this question of migrants. Yes, David. Tell us who you are and...
I'm Dave Corbett. I work at the Institute here. The seeming byword of the day in economics is inequality. Boris Johnson said here at the Institute quite recently, actually, that capitalism is ensuring that our society is more equal, not less equal. Is he right? Is capitalism the answer to inequality?
That's a very good big question. Any other thoughts before I go back to the panel? And I think we haven't heard enough from Nick at this point. Is capitalism something that produces greater equality? Or might it in the future produce greater equality? Or might it, for certain people, I'm asking a genderized question here, produce greater equality? Your chance first of all, Nick. And then Victoria.
I'm going to say two things. It all depends, and it's too soon to tell. Right. Those are standard economic historians' cop-outs. But nevertheless, I think on this occasion they're probably valid. So if you'd asked this question as of 30 years ago, I think Boris would have had a better chance of, generally speaking, lots of people agreeing with him. You know, we think about the progress of capitalist economies, the United States, the UK. We tend to see a phase of increasing inequality in the early stages of their move through industrialization, followed by what seems to be a reduction in inequality on all standard measures at least. And in the UK context, that probably reaches its limit somewhere in the 1970s. But generally speaking, I think there had been a lot of belief that that was the direction of travel. Clearly, the last 30 years suggest something different about trends in income inequality in actually pretty much the whole of the OECD, but certainly in the UK and in the US to a slightly more pronounced degree. If you then say what sort of things are the driving forces, let me mention two, one of which is picked on by our friend Piketty and one of which isn't. And they're both rather technical phrases, and that's why I think the all depends is correct. One is how substitutable are capital and labour. If we have an economy in which capital is being accumulated very strongly and it's not very substitutable for labour, the elasticity of substitution is low in the economist jargon, then the tendency is to push the distribution of income in labour's favour. If the elasticity of substitution is rather high, which is Piketty's claim, then it goes in the other direction. As an economic historian, I think that has varied between periods. I do not think there's an iron law of capitalism which tells you what the elasticity of substitution is. It turns on the technological era, a whole number of things. Okay, the second thing that we, I think, need to ask ourselves is about the nature of technological change. Capitalism's great strength, it seems to me, is its ability to generate technological progress. And that was, in effect, one of the massive Achilles heels of the Soviet Union. Okay, but then the question is, how biased is this technological progress? Does it tend to save more capital or does it tend to save more labour? If the factor-saving bias of technological progress is heavily labour-saving, then I suspect that we are in for worries about that income distribution. If we look forward or we look at what's been happening in the most recent past, we see the predominant technologies coming from ICT and computerization hollowing out employment in the West, and in the very near future removing a very large fraction of the low-wage jobs that are in the economy at the moment. How the labour market will absorb that, I'm not quite sure in the fullness of time, but in the immediate sort of period of the shock, I suspect that will be inequality increasing and generate some quite serious social problems to boot. So I noticed to my delight, because I'm hopeless in the kitchen, the robot chef is just around the corner. But think of the robot chef and the jobs that the robot chef will be taking the place of. You see the sort of thing that I'm thinking about. I'm delighted to know, incidentally, that robots can now mow my lawn, and they're getting a lot cheaper. I hate lawn mowing. I shall be better off as a result of this. But again, you see the sort of thing that I'm pointing to. So again, I don't think the factor-saving bias of technological progress is an iron law of capitalism either. I think it varies from period to period and so on. So I've chickened out in my answer, Hal, but I've tried to chicken out at a high level of confusion.
In a really entertaining way and very interesting and good to know about the lawn in Kenilworth. And yes, Benedict.
Well, I'm glad I had a moment to gather my thoughts, because at first my shock was that I had to contemplate the possibility Boris Johnson might be wrong about something.
Yes.
But after I then thought about it, if that's a possibility, yes, I think he is wrong. I think there have been inequalities, and I think there always will be. It's in the nature of our social relations. What would make me say that capitalism works, notwithstanding the fact that we encounter inequalities, it's always different people who are unequal. As long as that keeps on changing, I say I wouldn't even have a problem with it. I'd actually welcome it.
Well, now, Victoria, a greater equality, here comes the genderized moment, for professional middle-class women is surely one of the great features of the labour market over the past 20, 25 years. But what are the prospects for the future of capitalism in this regard, and does it involve something wider socially in terms of women working and their participation in the labour force?
I think one of the problems with the inequality debate that has been going on since and before Piketty's book is that it has focused on rich versus poor. And there are many other elements, racial elements, gender elements and so on, that are so tied up with the inequality between the rich and poor that tend to be ignored by economists, much less so by sociologists. There are a number working on the interlinks between race, gender and income inequality over in the US. But I do think that whilst there has been a degree of gender equality achieved here in the West over recent decades, that there has at the same time been increasing inequality between women. So you have those women at the top that have managed to break through glass ceilings, that have become highly educated, that have managed to get onto boards or into the upper echelons of management. And then you have the women at the bottom living in poverty. Some of them single mothers, some of them effectively abandoned by men who, to be frank, have abdicated responsibility to those women, leaving the state and the women to pick up the pieces. So I think you have you've seen a growing disparity between women, those at the top very successful, and then those at the bottom. And with that, that obviously has links with child poverty issues and so on. And I think that inequality between women needs to be addressed. In the words of one feminist writer, Laurie Penny, feminism, like wealth, does not trickle down. And that's something that, that we need to work more on. Tackling the issues of those women at the bottom of the ladder, not just those trying to get to the top. But can I talk about women more generally in the global sphere? Because obviously the problems we face here in the West are nothing compared with those of women across the globe. And this brings me to the point that women are not only a missing element in the inequality debate, they're a missing element in practically all of the macroeconomic debate surrounding issues of slow growth, deflation, what economists call secular stagnation, and so on. And I mean, the way that I would diagnose the problems of the global economy at the current time are that the global economy is suffering from a severe sex problem. So if we go back to this issue of immigration, what we have seen since the globalization of the world economy is an increase in the effective supply of labor. I mentioned this earlier, the offshoring and the ability of firms to tap the labor supply of developing economies. And what this has done is to reduce the bargaining power of workers in the West, that obviously feeding into the inequality dimension. By reducing the value of labour, it has also encouraged firms to move away from using capital and towards more labour-intensive production processes in some sectors. With that, you've seen reducing investment. With that, falling interest rates that are so troubling at central banks, who are desperately trying to get interest rates down to the level they need to be to ensure there's enough demand in the economy. And with that lower investment also comes faltering productivity growth. And to my mind, the solution to this is simple. You empower women out there in poorer countries. If you think about the average woman living out there in a poor country, she has no agency of the kind we economists assume in our models, where we employ the invisible hand and we think of individuals as pursuing their own self-interest, and that self-interest will lead to the wider good. What we have is women who are very often seen as a cost, who are married off at a young age, who are producing baby after baby in slum conditions. And that all, of course, contributes to world population growth, undermines the attempts to raise income and standard of living in poorer countries, and at the same time contributes to the problems here in the West, the declining bargaining power of workers, the low investment, low productivity, low interest rates, and so on. So to my mind, the solution is you empower women. If you give women economic freedom, educational and work opportunities, their womb becomes their own. They are in charge of their baby-making capacities. They will, through the ability to have agency, through the ability to employ their own self-interest, they will make fertility decisions, decisions about work and family that will not only mean that their own family can escape poverty, but that helps the West as well.
It is the most astonishing feature of the history of the material development of humanity that was achieved by and large just by unleashing the economic potential of one half of the human race. And that if one looks at the future prospects for capitalism, it must involve the greater extension of the opportunities for the other half of the human race. And after that, we have just about enough time for the third big question here that I have in front of me that's been sent in. And here we are. And again, it's a general election kind of question, and it's about housing. We are facing, supposedly, a housing shortage, particularly in London. The expansion of cities in Europe is a feature of the expansion of the economy and commercial practices shown in Italy in the 14th century, in Holland in the 17th century, as we heard in Professor Prock's lecture last week, in England in the 19th century, India in the 20th, and Japan and China in the 21st. What does a historical perspective tell us about how we might solve such a crisis and about the need to solve a crisis? I wonder whether, Benedict, you'd like to start.
Well, capitalism and cities go together because capitalism is about bringing people together. The more people you have in the same place, the easier it is for capitalism to snowball. It's about exchange and it's about markets. The bigger the city, the better it is for capitalism.
And exchange of ideas.
And of exchange of ideas. So capitalist culture is an urban culture. And I understand we are now just at the very close to the state where half the world lives in cities. Which is a historical new development. Now, is that a crisis? To me, that's not a crisis. I think it's the run of history. What is described, I hope I'm not misinterpreting where you see the crisis. It has to do with house prices. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, but house prices are not the cause of capitalism. It's the cause of government intervention. It's the cause of the intervention by monetary authorities who are placing greater amounts of cash in the hands of the public, who one would have hoped would put them into productive assets, but instead put them into homes, which are not really productive. So one of the great differences between the policy responses of the recession in the 1930s is that government spending gave you things such as the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, but quantitative easing has yet to produce a single bridge. What it's produced is a rise in the houses of people who are the beneficiaries of quantitative easing. So the crisis is it's not housing, it's government intervention in financial markets.
And turning housing into a highly profitable form of investment does have certain social consequences. Nick, what are your thoughts about capitalism and housing?
Well, let me first of all agree with Benedict that cities are pretty important to economic development and to economic growth and to the achievement of high productivity. You know, we talk in economics about the benefits of agglomeration, and they come in a variety of ways, some of which were familiar to Adam Smith or Alfred Marshall or whatever. They're benefits from specialisation quite often, sometimes from diversity. That said, cities can get too big. And there's another side, which is that large cities engender in one way or another what we might call congestion costs. And those congestion costs are sort of fighting against the benefits of agglomeration. That's perhaps partly where housing comes in, because if you think about the effective size of a city, a lot of this turns on who can actually work in the city rather than necessarily reside in it. So what we have in a city like London is actually a large volume of commuting. That maybe we could make the commuting less costly and over a shorter distance on average by changing the way in which we run our housing market. So here's where I slightly take a different tack from Benedict. I agree with him that there is a massive problem of government intervention. But I see that problem as not so much raising demand. Demand is going to grow anyway from higher incomes, demand for housing, but hugely restricting supply. And in particular, restricting the supply of land for residential building. We've made it essentially, or virtually completely inelastic in the southeast. And that comes from greenbelt policies, planning rules, and so on. We know that a liberalised housing market would have both many more houses in it and much cheaper houses. That tells you what the problem is. who's going to vote for capital losses on their own house or the disamenities that might come from greater housing? I'm afraid we've locked ourselves into the consequences of the system of regulation which we introduced in the 1940s and has continued largely unchanged. Let me just add a historical note. I take the point about things like the Golden Gate Bridge in the United States, but if we were talking about recovery from the depression of the 1930s in the UK, actually housing investment was a very important part of it. It was the transmission mechanism from cheap money, as they saw it then, into economic activity. But the virtue of that transmission mechanism in the 30s was it translated into more houses, not just more expensive houses. There is a massive difference between the two. So in a sense, I do accept what you said, but if I put that gloss on it, it gives a slightly different angle.
Well, land and housing, Victoria. Well, you're a fellow of Cambridge College that owns a fair bit of land. Not as much land as some other Cambridge colleges, but still a fair bit. So does this fellowship of yours actually form part of the problem? Or might you want to transform the debate in terms of housing?
Well, yes, I probably shouldn't comment on my Cambridge College. I guess what you are getting at there is the inequality of land holdings within the economy, and that surely does have a role to play in addition to the factors that have been pointed out here to my left. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had more than a taste here this evening of just how... Oh, yes, Solana, you would like... Time for one more? Yes, just one more, since it's you.
My name is Alana Putz. I work with Hull on the History of Capitalism program. I'm wondering if we could end today's panel by looking forward. We've talked about some of the challenges in capitalism, hubris or overregulation or greed, but we've also talked about it being a force for good in society. And I'm wondering, looking forward, is there a way that we can steward capitalism to make it better or more effective for future generations?
Right. Quick responses in three. Reforming it, being careful, being cautious, one hand, but also needing to release all these energies on the other. Difficult getting those two things to work together. And I see that Nick's going to come in quite soon now, but also Benedict, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the future of capitalism depends on recovery and improvement of our values of civil society and of the value of responsibility, frugality, self-reliance, and taking responsibility for your actions. And states bailing out people for their mistakes is not going to engender an attitude that permeates civil society, which says we want to build a better country.
Nick.
Two thoughts, really. One is that I think globalization makes it much more difficult to steward capitalism well. And the line of argument I would put forward there, given more time, is in particular globalization which makes capital mobile. If capital is mobile and has the choice of locations, it makes it much harder to tax and, in principle, probably to regulate. So we were all thinking about financial markets and the problems. We talked about that earlier this evening. If you think about what happened in the regulation of financial markets, I think we saw a race to the bottom in the last 15 or 20 years of the 20th century and paid the price in the first 10 years of the 21st century. In the very capital-controlled world of the 1950s, it was much easier to address that issue. It was addressed in a very heavy-handed way, but that's by the way. So that's my first thought. My second thought is that I suspect a lot of people would think a pretty big issue facing us is climate change. Supposing we believe that that's the case just for a moment, what's the nature of the problem? I think it is that a good climate, avoiding the adverse changes in the climate, is what economists would think of as a public good, or the opposite is a public bad. The problem with public goods is that the market typically underprovides them, and you have to have some way of agreeing how to pay for them to share out the costs. I think we've seen in successive international discussions about climate change that that is a very difficult collective action problem. And climate change is a very big market failure, potentially, for the reasons that I've just suggested. So on those two grounds, I think I'm a bit more pessimistic probably than I would have been a few decades ago, when I would have said maybe addressing market failures is something we can get better at and do something about. You know, lots of good taxes, a la Professor Pigou. So I don't think that quite does the job.
Yes. Reference to Professor Pigou, I've not heard that for many a long year.
I was going to say Pigovian, but I thought that might be a bit step too far.
And Victoria, ultimate final thought from Victoria. Where might one possibly find the steward who could possibly do this job of controlling this big ism without being too heavy-handed about it?
Well, I think what we need is a full-scale rethinking of both the role of the market and the role of the state in the economy. Since the global financial crisis, we've been putting up the barricades and we have been taking sides, either the side for the free market and minimal state, or the side where the state should intervene in many possible ways. And we seem to be going in a old Labour socialist direction there. And I think those barricades need to come down. Neither the state nor the market is perfect. Each side has something to accept there. The market can bring many good things, but there are also market failures that have been pointed to by Nick Crafts that we need to acknowledge. Now, the state has, in history, done many bad things, but it can also do much good. It can help design markets in a way that works for everyone. It can help fund scientific invention, innovation, and that can help support the activities done by the private sector, but at the same time it needs to give scientific researchers the freedom they need, and I think that's something where we could be doing better now. And also the state should take a responsibility in managing the adverse side effects that creative destruction and economic growth can sometimes bring at the societal levels. And there, I must say, I am in part influenced by my upbringing in East Manchester.
There we are. Well, Manchester has literally the last word, almost, for this evening. And, ladies and gentlemen, in the quick minds, ready wits and fertile historical imaginations that you've heard at work this evening, you've had more than a glimpse of just why the History of Capitalism course in 2014 has been such a wonderful success, and why we are now building on its success as we power our way through lecture series year 2 and begin to think about year 3 as well. I'm extremely grateful to Benedict Köhler and to Victoria Batesman and to Nicola Crafts for coming along and joining us here this evening. And I'm extremely grateful to them for helping me to put some flesh on the bare bones of the thoughts that I had in the late autumn of 2013, when I was told that, well, you can do all this, but go away and really do it really well. So thank you, all of you, for helping me to do it so very well indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel.